On August 20, 1989, the Menendez brothers dialed 911 to report a nightmare. Their parents, Jose and Kitty, lay dead in their Beverly Hills mansion, riddled with shotgun blasts. Within hours, Lyle and Erik became the prime suspects. The press called them spoiled, greedy, remorseless. The prosecution painted them as killers who murdered for money, and America believed it. They were convicted of cold-blooded murder. But hidden beneath the lies, the money, and the bloodshed was a secret that took decades to unravel. A secret buried in their tearful courtroom testimony, dismissed as a desperate lie. A secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about guilt, innocence, and what happens behind closed doors. The brothers claimed they'd been terrorized for years, physically beaten, psychologically tortured, sexually violated by their own father. Jose Menendez, a Hollywood executive with a ferocious temper, was portrayed as a monster. Kitty, they said, knew and did nothing. But jurors didn't buy it. To the public, it sounded like a script, a last-ditch act to escape the gas chamber. The media mocked their tears. The world moved on. Yet the questions never disappeared. Why would two young men with every privilege turn shotguns on their parents? Why did their story shift from "strangers did this" to "we had no choice"? And why, decades later, are we still arguing about what really happened that night? The Menendez case was never just about murder. It was about what we're willing to hear and what we refuse to accept. In 1996, the idea that abuse could drive someone to kill was met with skepticism, even ridicule. Today, the conversation has changed. Survivors speak louder. Science understands trauma deeper, and a new generation is asking, did we get it right? Or did we condemn two broken children for a crime that began long before they pulled the trigger? This is the story of the Menendez brothers, not as tabloid villains, not as martyrs, but as the epicenter of a firestorm that forced America to confront its darkest questions. Who gets to be a victim? Who gets to be believed? And what happens when the truth is far more horrifying than the fiction we've been sold? August 20, 1989, a quiet Sunday evening in Beverly Hills. The Menendez mansion, a sprawling Mediterranean-style home on Elm Drive, sat undisturbed under the glow of streetlights. Inside, Jose and Kitty Menendez were unwinding in their den, a seemingly ordinary night in a life of wealth and privilege. Then gunfire. 12-gauge shotgun blasts shattered the silence. The force of each shot ripped through the air, echoing across the quiet neighborhood. By the time it was over, 14 rounds had been fired. Jose Menendez, a powerful Hollywood executive, was hit first, one shot to the back of the head as he lounged on the couch. Instant, fatal, no time to react. But the shooting didn't stop there. Kitty Menendez had no chance to escape. The attackers reloaded, pursued her, and fired again. The scene was chaotic, shell casings scattered across the floor, blood smeared on furniture, and a final chilling detail, the overkill. Kitty had been shot multiple times, her body nearly unrecognizable from the repeated blast. This was not the work of an amateur. It was personal, relentless, and calculated. Just after 11 p.m., a 911 call came in. 911, what's your emergency? A man's voice, trembling but controlled. Someone killed my parents. It was Lyle Menendez. His words were frantic, yet something was missing. Shock? Genuine terror? Or was this the voice of someone who knew exactly what had happened? When officers arrived, the mansion was in disarray, but something felt off. There were no signs of forced entry. No valuables had been taken. The only obvious victims were Jose and Kitty Menendez. If this was a robbery, it was a strange one. Detectives took note of every detail, the placement of shell casings, the angle of the shots, and the eerie calm of the two young men who stood outside, waiting. Lyle, 21, and Erik, 18, the golden boys of Beverly Hills. At first, the story seemed clear. The brothers told police they had spent the evening at a movie theater watching Batman, then returned home to find their parents murdered. They were distraught, inconsolable. Erik, the younger of the two, was visibly shaking. Lyle spoke for both of them. giving police a timeline that, on the surface, made sense. But the brutality of the crime raised questions. Overkill usually meant one thing: rage, and rage wasn't common in random break-ins. As crime scene analysts worked through the night, detectives found themselves circling one unsettling possibility. What if the killers were standing right in front of them? But why would two privileged sons turn their parents into targets? To the outside world, the Menendez brothers had everything. Jose Menendez was a self-made millionaire, an executive who had worked his way to the top of Hollywood's corporate world. His sons grew up surrounded by luxury, private schools, country clubs, and the kind of wealth most could only dream of. Lyle, the older brother, was charismatic, ambitious. Erik, the quieter of the two, was a talented tennis player with aspirations of going pro. Together they were known as well-mannered, privileged young men. They were heirs to a fortune, raised with every opportunity, which made what happened next all the more suspicious. Within weeks of their parents' murders, Lyle and Erik began living as if they had just won the lottery. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, Rolex watches, luxury clothing, courtside seats at Lakers games. Lyle bought a $64,000 Porsche. Erik hired a personal tennis coach and traveled the world, staying in five-star hotels. They moved into penthouse suites, ate at the most expensive restaurants, and took shopping sprees that defied logic for two young men who had just lost their parents in a brutal crime. To investigators, their actions didn't resemble grief. They resembled celebration. But why? Were they simply coping with trauma in the only way they knew how? Or was this something else? Friends of the Menendez brothers began to notice cracks in the facade. At first, they assumed the brothers were trying to distract themselves from the horrific loss, but there was something unsettling. One former friend later recalled they kept saying they were scared, but of what? Scared of the killers returning, or scared of getting caught? With each passing week, detectives grew more certain that this case wasn't what it seemed. The brothers weren't behaving like victims. They were acting like two people who had just erased a problem. What had started as an open and shut burglary case was beginning to unravel. And then Erik Menendez made a mistake that would break the case wide open. The trial of Lyle and Erik Menendez began in 1993, but it was far from an ordinary murder case. This wasn't just about two brothers accused of killing their parents. It was about wealth, privilege, and a disturbing question at the center of it all. Were they cold-blooded murderers or survivors of years of unthinkable abuse? From the moment the courtroom doors opened, the nation was transfixed. The prosecution painted a picture of greed. Two young men who couldn't wait for their inheritance, who executed their parents in a calculated act of violence. But when the defense took the floor, the story shifted dramatically. Through tearful testimonies, Lyle and Erik laid out a harrowing narrative. They described their father, Jose Menendez, not as a successful businessman and doting parent, but as a controlling, sadistic figure who ruled the household with fear. They claimed that behind the doors of their Beverly Hills mansion, they endured years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. In one of the trial's most unforgettable moments, Erik, voice shaking, described how his father had molested him for years, how the abuse began when he was just a child and continued well into his teenage years. "I was scared all the time," he told the court, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't think I could ever escape." Lyle, just as emotional, claimed he had suffered the same abuse and had tried to protect his younger brother from their father's cruelty. The courtroom was silent. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Reporters scribbled furiously. The weight of their words hung in the air. But not everyone believed them. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanich, called the brothers' claims a phony defense, a desperate ploy to avoid responsibility for their crimes. They weren't abused children, Bozanich told the jury. They were spoiled, entitled, and driven by greed. She pointed to their lavish spending after the murders, their expensive new wardrobes, their high-end sports cars. If they were so traumatized, why did they act like lottery winners? For every tear the brothers shed on the stand, the prosecution countered with cold, hard numbers: $14 million. That was the inheritance Lyle and Erik would have received. To the state, this wasn't a story of survival. It was a premeditated financial decision. The country was divided. Some saw two terrified young men who had been pushed to their breaking point. Others saw privileged killers who had concocted a defense so shocking that it might just save their lives. But if their story was fabricated, why did so many experts believe them? Forensic psychologists who testified for the defense argued that years of unchecked trauma could have created a kill-or-be-killed mentality, an explosion of fear and rage that ended in murder. Others pointed to crucial evidence the public had never seen before: letters Erik wrote to his cousin months before the murders. In these letters, he described the abuse in disturbing detail. In one letter, Erik wrote, "I don't know what to do anymore. My father still does things to me. I want to tell someone, but I'm too scared. I don't want to live like this." For many, these words felt like proof. If the allegations were just a last-minute legal strategy, why was Erik documenting them long before his parents were killed? Still, the prosecution dismissed the letters as unreliable. They insisted that if the abuse had been real, why hadn't the brothers gone to the police? Why hadn't they run away? The defense countered with a haunting argument. They couldn't run, they couldn't escape, and when they finally did, it was through gunfire. But was that justification for murder? After months of testimony, hours of gut-wrenching testimony, and a case that shook the nation, it all came down to one moment. The jury had deliberated for days. When they returned, the courtroom was packed. The world was watching. Lyle and Erik sat frozen as the verdict was read: guilty of first-degree murder. The air was sucked out of the room. The brothers sat motionless. Their attorneys shifted in their seats. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was a stunning moment. Two sons who claimed they had suffered years of unimaginable horror were now convicted as ruthless killers. The judge handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case was over, but the questions never went away. Had justice been served? Or had the court dismissed years of suffering in favor of an easier, more convenient truth? Even decades later, that question remains unanswered. For years, the Menendez case seemed sealed, a tragic but straightforward story of murder and greed. But in 2023, cracks began to appear in the version of events that had put Erik and Lyle behind bars for life. Former jurors, once unwavering in their verdict, started reconsidering the case. "We didn't understand trauma back then," one admitted in a rare interview. "The way the defense presented the abuse claims, it felt exaggerated. But now, I'm not so sure." Forensic psychology has evolved dramatically since the 1990s. Back then, many people struggled to grasp the way prolonged abuse can warp a person's sense of reality, how fear can override rational decision-making. Now, experts argue that the Menendez brothers' actions fit a textbook case of battered person syndrome, a state of learned helplessness and psychological breakdown, leading to a fight-or-flight response. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came from within the Menendez family itself. A relative, one who had never spoken publicly, broke their silence. And what they revealed changed everything. This family member provided a crucial piece of evidence, a diary entry from Kitty Menendez, the brothers' mother. The entry, written months before the murders, hinted at her knowledge of what was happening inside the home. "I feel sick about what I know, but I can't stop it. I am too weak." It was a chilling admission. Did Kitty know about the abuse? And if so, had she turned a blind eye? To some, this was undeniable proof that Lyle and Erik had been telling the truth all along. To others, it was too little, too late. In 2024, the Netflix series Monsters, the Lyle and Erik Menendez story, reignited the controversy. Created by Ryan Murphy, the series didn't just rehash the crime, it dug deep into the allegations of abuse, the overlooked evidence, and the social climate that shaped the original trial. Actors who portrayed Lyle and Erik spoke candidly about the emotional toll of playing the roles. "You go into it thinking you know the story," one actor admitted in an interview, "but once you really absorb what these guys went through, it's hard not to see them as victims too." But the series didn't just spark conversations in Hollywood, it ignited a movement online. TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube exploded with debates. A new generation, too young to remember the case firsthand, began dissecting old footage, questioning the prosecution's arguments, and demanding justice. "They were victims first," one protester shouted outside a courthouse, surrounded by signs reading, "Free the Menendez brothers." But others weren't so convinced. "They planned it," a skeptical commentator argued. "Abused or not, they had a choice, and they chose murder." It was a moral debate that had no easy answers. With renewed attention on the case, the Menendez brothers' legal team saw an opportunity. They filed a motion for resentencing, arguing that the court's understanding of trauma in the 1990s was deeply flawed. "Back then, the system failed them," one of their attorneys stated. "It's time to make it right." But the prosecution was just as determined. "They're still killers," a former district attorney scoffed. "You can dress it up however you want. It doesn't change the fact that they walked into that living room and fired those shots." The defense wasn't backing down. "Or survivors?" their lawyer countered. "How long do we punish victims for saving themselves?" The fight wasn't over. More than 3 decades have passed since the Menendez brothers were convicted, but their story refuses to fade. At the height of the 1990s true crime boom, their case was tabloid gold. Headlines plastered across glossy magazines painted them as greedy, spoiled killers who executed their parents in cold blood. Talk shows dissected every tear, every contradiction, every moment in the courtroom. But time has shifted public perception. Today, their case has taken on new meaning. True crime podcasters and legal analysts have re-examined the trial, drawing unsettling parallels between the Menendez brothers and other survivors of long-term abuse. Some argue that their conviction wasn't just a failure of justice. It was a failure to recognize the psychological damage caused by years of trauma. Online, the conversation continues. Hashtags like Menendez brothers and Justice for Lyle and Erik trend as younger generations, unburdened by the media's original portrayal, revisit the evidence. To them, Erik and Lyle aren't symbols of greed. They're symbols of a broken system that didn't know how to handle their truth. One thing is certain, the Menendez brothers' case has evolved from a sensationalized murder trial into something far more complicated. Today, Erik and Lyle Menendez remain behind bars, serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. But in the confines of their prison walls, they continue to tell their story. In a rare prison interview, Erik speaks softly into a crackling phone line. "I just want people to know the truth," he says. Lyle, now in his mid-50s, has found solace in the family he never had. In 2003, he married Rebecca Sneed, a woman who has stood by him for over 2 decades. "They're not monsters," she insists. "The real monster was in that house." The brothers, once inseparable, are now incarcerated in separate prisons, kept apart for decades. They write letters to each other, but they will never sit in the same room again. For them, the past is unchangeable, but the present, that's still a fight. Despite years of legal battles, the core question of this case remains the same. Did 2 broken boys commit an unforgivable crime, or did the system fail to see the crime that came first? There will always be those who believe that Erik and Lyle Menendez are where they belong, that their actions were not an act of survival, but an act of greed. But for others, the case is far from closed. Because when you strip away the money, the mansions, and the media spectacle, What's left? Two children who were never heard until it was too late. The story of Lyle and Erik Menendez did not end with their conviction. For nearly 3 decades, they have remained behind bars, serving life sentences with no chance of parole, no appeals, no retrials. But even now, the debate rages on. Were they calculating murderers who executed their parents for money? Or were they two sons, pushed to the edge by years of abuse, who saw no other way out? In recent years, their case has found new life. New evidence, long-buried letters, and changing perspectives on abuse have reignited discussions about their fate. A petition for resentencing now sits before the courts. For the first time in years, there is a sliver of hope that their sentences could be reevaluated. But the question remains, will the world ever see them as victims, or will they forever be remembered as the boys who killed their parents? Justice was served, but was it the right justice?